There are moments in a man's life when something shifts underneath him, like the ground isn't quite solid anymore, and he can't tell you exactly why. He just knows. I've been a carpenter for 38 years. I've stood on scaffolding 4 stories up in January wind and never once felt my knees go weak. But the morning I read that text message from my ex-wife, I felt something I hadn't felt since the day my father died. Not fear exactly. Something older than fear. The kind of feeling that lives in your chest and won't explain itself. The text said, "Come get the rest of your tools and junk by Saturday morning or I'm putting it all at the curb. I'm not storing your life in my garage anymore." My tools. 30 years of Snap-on, DeWalt, and Festool. A table saw my father left me. 2 toolboxes that together weighed more than my truck. She knew exactly what she was threatening. She always knew exactly what she was threatening. My ex-wife's name is Renee. We were married for 22 years. Our daughter, my youngest, is 9 years old. Her name is Gracie. My son from a previous relationship, Daniel, was 17 at the time. He lived with me full-time. Gracie lived with Renee, with her boyfriend moving in about 4 months after I moved out. His name was Troy. He was 34 years old. He had a tattoo on his neck and a temper I'd seen once at a school event that I had never been able to forget. The divorce had been ugly in the way that only divorces involving real estate and children can be ugly. The custody arrangement said I got Gracie every other weekend and 1 evening each week for dinner. In practice, it never worked that cleanly. There was always something. Gracie was sick. Gracie had a recital. Gracie had a sleepover she'd already committed to. I stopped fighting it after a while because every time I pushed back, the next scheduled visit got harder. That's how it works when the other person controls access. You learn to take what you can get and be grateful. The last time I had seen Gracie had been 3 weeks before. She had been quiet in a way that unsettled me. She sat in my truck on the way to dinner and looked out the window the whole time. I asked her what was wrong and she said nothing. Daddy. And the way she said it was too careful, like she'd practiced saying nothing in a way that sounded like something. I asked her again over our food and she said she was just tired. She'd barely touched her burger. I drove her home and watched her walk to the front door and disappear inside, and I sat in that driveway for longer than I should have before I put the truck in reverse. I called my son that night, even though he was just in the other room. I told him something felt off with his sister. He got quiet in a way that reminded me of Gracie and said she was probably just having a hard week. I let it go. I shouldn't have let it go. Saturday was the deadline Renee had given me. I had made arrangements to borrow a flatbed from a buddy of mine for that morning. But on Thursday evening, my buddy called and said the flatbed was free right now if I wanted it. Something had fallen through, and he needed it back by Saturday noon. I called Renee to tell her I'd be coming Thursday evening instead. She didn't answer. I left a voicemail. I sent a text. Nothing back for 2 hours, and then just, fine. I drove over after dinner. It was around 7:30, still some light left. The house looked the same as it always had, white siding, black shutters, the oak tree in the front yard that I had planted the year Gracie was born. Troy's truck was in the driveway. Every light in the front of the house was on. I could hear the television through the door when I walked up the porch steps, some kind of game show, loud. I knocked. Renee opened the door and didn't invite me in. She told me the garage code was still the same, the tools were against the back wall, and she'd appreciate it if I was done and gone within the hour. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention Gracie. I didn't see Gracie anywhere behind her. I said, "Is Gracie here? I'd like to say hello." She said, "She's at a friend's." I said okay and walked around the side of the house toward the garage. There was no reason not to believe her. Kids go to friends' houses on Thursday evenings. It happens. I told myself, it happens. The garage was detached, set back from the house, connected to the yard by a flagstone path. My tools were exactly where she said they were. I started moving the smaller cases to the flatbed and worked my way up to the heavy stuff. I was on my second trip when I heard it. A sound. From the direction of the backyard shed. I stopped walking. The shed was an old aluminum structure I had built myself about 12 years ago, maybe 10 feet by 12. I used to store lawn equipment in it, a workbench along one wall. Renee had never used it for anything. After I moved out, I assumed it mostly held seasonal decorations and whatever else accumulates in a shed when nobody has a use for it. The sound came again. It was small. It might have been an animal. A cat, maybe, or a raccoon that had gotten in through a gap somewhere. I almost talked myself into that. Almost. I walked toward the shed. The door had a padlock on it that I didn't recognize. A combination lock, the kind with a 4-digit code. There was no reason for a padlock on that shed. There had never been a padlock on that shed. I stood there looking at it for a moment that felt much longer than it was. I knocked on the door. Nothing. I knocked again and said, "Hello?" A pause. Then a voice, so small and so careful it nearly stopped my heart. "Daddy?" I don't know what I said next. I think I said her name. I think I said it more than once. I got my hand on the padlock and pulled at it, and of course it didn't open, and I said, "Gracie, are you okay? Are you hurt?" I pressed my ear against the aluminum door, and I could hear her breathing, fast and shallow, and she said, "I'm okay. I'm okay, Daddy." I asked her how long she had been in there. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Since yesterday morning." Yesterday morning? That was more than 30 hours. I asked her if she had water. She said there was a bottle, but it was empty now. I asked her if she was cold. It had been in the low 50s that night. She said she had a blanket. I asked her if she was alone, and she said yes. I said, "Baby, I'm going to get you out. Don't be scared." I walked back to the garage and found a bolt cutter on my second toolbox. I keep one in the chest because you never know on a job site when you'll need to cut a cable or a lock. I walked back to the shed, and I cut that padlock off in one motion. The door swung open. My daughter was sitting on the concrete floor against the back wall with a moving blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was wearing her school clothes, the same outfit I had seen in a photo Renee had sent me 4 days earlier. Her hair was tangled. There was a thin scratch on her forearm that she couldn't explain later. When she saw me, she didn't cry right away. She just looked at me with these enormous eyes like she was making sure I was real. Then she stood up and walked into my arms, and she cried like I have never heard a child cry before, full body sobbing, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and private that a 9-year-old should never have to know about. I held her and I breathed and I looked over her shoulder into that shed. There was the empty water bottle. There was a paper plate with the dried remnants of something, crackers, maybe, peanut butter. There was the moving blanket. And on the wall to the left, on the pegboard where I used to hang hand tools, there were marks. Small marks, scratched into the pegboard with what looked like a paper clip or a nail. Groups of 4 vertical lines with a diagonal slash through each group. Tally marks? I counted them. 11. Not 30 hours. Not her first time. I stood there holding my daughter and counting those marks and trying to breathe, and then I stopped trying to understand it because there wasn't time to understand it. There was only time to act. I scooped her up and carried her to my truck. I buckled her into the passenger seat. I told her she was safe, and I told her she was with me, and I told her nothing was going to happen to her. She had stopped crying by then, and she was holding my hand with both of hers and looking straight ahead through the windshield. I called 911 from the driveway. I know what some people will say. I know they'll say I should have called the moment I heard her voice. Maybe they're right. But 38 years of being told by family courts and lawyers that a father's instincts don't hold up in proceedings, 38 years of learning that a man who acts on what he feels rather than what he can prove tends to lose that wires you a certain way. I needed to have her in my hands before I made that call. I needed to know she was out. The dispatcher stayed on with me while I waited. Renee came out of the house before the squad cars did. She walked across the lawn with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she looked at me in the driver's seat and at the truck, and when she saw Gracie in the passenger seat, her face did something complicated that I can't fully describe. It wasn't surprise. Exactly. It was more like recalculation. She said, "What do you think you're doing?" I said, "The police are on their way." She said, "You broke into my property." You took my daughter without permission. I will have you arrested." She said it like she believed it. Like she'd said it before in her head and it had always worked out. I looked at her standing in the driveway in the yellow porch light, and I thought about 22 years, and I thought about Gracie's face when she first saw me in that doorway, and I didn't say anything back. There was nothing to say back. 2 squad cars arrived within 7 minutes. Then a third. Then, about 20 minutes after the first call, a woman in plain clothes who identified herself as a child services investigator. She had a calm face and a voice built for difficult conversations. She sat in the back seat of one of the squad cars with Gracie for a long time. Renee was talking to one of the officers on the lawn. I could see her gesturing at the shed, then at me, and I could see the officer's face not reacting the way she needed it to react. Troy had come out of the house by then. He was standing on the porch with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and he hadn't said anything to anyone. I noticed that. One of the other officers came and asked me to walk him through what had happened. I told him everything, start to finish. I showed him the cut padlock. I walked him into the shed and showed him the marks on the pegboard. He took photographs. He asked me if Gracie had said anything else to me, and I said she hadn't. She'd mostly just cried and held my hand, but I told him about the tally marks and what they implied. He looked at them for a long moment without speaking. Later that night, after Gracie had been examined at the hospital and cleared physically, she was dehydrated, had a low-grade bruise on her left hip she couldn't account for, was otherwise not physically injured. The investigator sat across from me in a small room and told me what Gracie had told her. Gracie said it had been happening for about 3 weeks. When she misbehaved, and I use that word very loosely because what Renee and Troy considered misbehavior was, according to my daughter, things like leaving a dish in the sink or crying. When she missed me, she was put in the shed. One night, the first time. Then, 2. The threat of it was used constantly, even on days she was never actually put there. She said Troy had told her it was how they did discipline in their house, and if she told anyone, including me, the next time would be a week. The marks on the pegboard were not continuous nights. They were separate incidents over that 3-week period. 11 total. My daughter was 9 years old, and she had been locked in an unheated aluminum shed in the backyard of her own home 11 times in 3 weeks, and every time I had called on the phone, she had spoken to me in a careful, normal voice, because she was afraid of what would happen if I knew. I sat in that room for a while after the investigator finished talking. I thought about her voice on the phone. I thought about dinner 3 weeks before, the way she'd barely touched her food, the way she'd looked out the window the whole drive. I thought about all the things a child learns to hide when hiding feels safer than telling. I thought about my son, who had been 17 and living with me full-time, who had seen his sister at school every day and had been quiet in that same careful way when I asked him about her. When I finally got to talk to my son that night, after we were home and Gracie was asleep in his old bed with every light in the hallway on because she'd asked me to keep them on, I asked him what he knew. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and he looked at his hands for a long time. He said, "I didn't know about the shed, Dad. I knew something was wrong. She told me at school that she wasn't allowed to say anything. She said Troy told her that if she caused problems, she'd lose her room and have to sleep outside." I thought he meant like a tent in the yard. I didn't know it was a real place. I didn't know it was happening like that. He looked up at me. He said, "I'm sorry. I should have told you. I knew something was wrong, and I didn't tell you." I reached across the table and put my hand on his arm, and I said, "You didn't put her in that shed. You hear me? That's not something you're carrying." He nodded, but I could see he was going to carry it anyway, at least for a while, the way young people carry things before they learn which parts actually belong to them. I understood that. I let him feel what he needed to feel. Renee was arrested that night. Troy was arrested separately, about an hour later. The charges included child endangerment and unlawful confinement. Renee's attorney released a statement the following morning about how the situation had been mischaracterized and how a full accounting would vindicate her client. I didn't read past the first sentence. The custody arrangement was suspended immediately, pending the investigation. Gracie came to live with me. The first few weeks were hard in the quiet ways that hard things usually are. She woke up some nights and needed the light on and needed to hear my voice. She didn't talk much about the shed on her own. The counselor she started seeing said that was normal, that kids process lateral trauma sideways, meaning they work through it in small pieces and often through play or drawings rather than direct conversation. She drew a lot of pictures during that time. Most of them were of the house, our house, my truck, the dog we got her in the second week because she asked and I couldn't think of a single reason to say no. She named the dog Thursday. I asked her why Thursday, and she said, "Because that's the day you found me." I had to leave the room after she said that. Old men are allowed to cry in their own kitchens. Renee pled guilty to child endangerment 6 months later as part of a plea agreement. She received 3 years probation, mandatory parenting classes, and a permanent restraining order keeping her from unsupervised contact with Gracie. Troy pled guilty to unlawful confinement of a minor. He received 14 months in county jail. A lot of people asked me if I was satisfied with that. 14 months, 3 years probation. Was I satisfied? The honest answer is that I don't spend much energy thinking about their sentences. I spent a lot of years thinking about what Renee deserved and what I deserved and what fairness looked like, and it cost me things I can't get back. What I think about now is Thursday, the dog asleep at the foot of my granddaughter's bed, and the lights I leave on in the hallway every night without being asked anymore, and the way Gracie laughed last month at the kitchen table so hard she knocked over her orange juice. That's where I put my energy. I want to say something to anyone listening to this who knows that feeling, that specific feeling I described at the beginning, that wordless thing in your chest that something is wrong and you cannot prove it and nobody is going to believe you until there's something to show. I want to say this. Trust it. Do not talk yourself out of it with logic. Do not let the systems that failed you before convince you to stay quiet one more time. I almost talked myself into believing she was at a friend's house. I almost loaded my table saw onto the flatbed and drove away and went home and called my lawyer in the morning to start the official process of worrying. That would have been another night in that shed. Trust the feeling. Move toward the thing you can't explain. And if you find nothing, then you find nothing and you go home and you were wrong and the world is fine. But if you find something, if you find what I found, you will never regret for 1 second that you went. My daughter is 10 now. She plays on a soccer team. She is not the fastest kid on the field, but she runs like she means it and she doesn't quit. Last Saturday, I sat on the bleachers in a folding chair next to my son, and we watched her chase a ball into the corner of the field and muscle it away from a girl twice her size, and I put my hand over my mouth because sometimes the ordinary moments are the ones that undo you. She looked over at the bleachers after that play, and she found my face in the crowd the way she always does now, immediately, like a needle finding north. She raised her hand and waved. I waved back. That's the story. That's what I found.